Okay, so then I guess I'll start a little again. So welcome to the Science and Policy Exchange panel titled EDI in Action, Inspiring Black, Indigenous, and People of Color across the Canadian science policy landscape. So SP would like to thank CC UNESCO for supporting this event. And we'll be putting up a very short poll to get to know you better, as this is an event on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So all of this is anonymous, and you're free to answer or not. But we would like to get to know you better. So we begin by acknowledging the lands on which we gather today. Science and Policy Exchange is based in Jojage, Montreal, the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also referred to as the Iroquois or Six Nations Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. We further acknowledge the deep ties between colonialism and modern Western science and research, especially in Jojage, where it is host to a large research. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. So we'll start with Shweta. Hi, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Mian. Thank you, Science and Policy Exchange, for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here. I am grateful to be joining from Banff National Park today, which is within the present-day territories of the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 First Nations, as well as the Métis homeland. My name is Shweta Ganapathy. I'm currently a senior policy advisor at NSERC, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. My background, scientific background, is in chemistry. I trained as a supramolecular chemist, worked with a class of compounds called molecular containers for some therapeutic applications. That was long ago. I did a little bit of research after I graduated, was making low-cost vaccines way before the pandemic. So I'm grateful for having learned a little bit more about that. But then I had a strong interest in science policy around the time that I was graduating. It took me 3 years to figure out how to get into this field. And I started out as program manager for the Canadian Science Policy Centre, CSPC. I worked there for a year. I then applied to the MIDAC Science Policy Fellowship, which is sadly suspended at present. Usually I advocate for that fellowship quite a lot. It's a great entry point into the public service if you're interested. But anyhow, I got that fellowship in 2020, and I joined NSERC as a science policy fellow at the level of a policy analyst. And then I really enjoyed my time there, and I think it's been about 3 years. And currently, I, as senior policy advisor, work in international relations. My team is called Policy and Government Relations. It's all a lot of big words, but we'll break that down later in today's discussion. So with that, I'll pause. Thank you.
Thanks. Taylor, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon for most of you. My name is Taylor Morso. I am a member of Peguis First Nation, and I'm joining today on my traditional territories, Treaty 1, and the beautiful lands that I get to live on. It's a beautiful day here, so hopefully we all get to go outside after this. I am a postdoctoral fellow with the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba, or FNISM for short. We are the only First Nations-led research organization within the Manitoba region. And the work that I'm really privileged to do there focuses on Indigenous data sovereignty, which of course intersects with policy and health policy. And I'm really fortunate to work with a team led by Stephanie Sinclair at FNISM, and also to have really wonderful mentors. So I have to acknowledge Leona Starr and Dr. Billy Joe Hardy and so many others in my life that allowed me to pursue this path. And I think we'll get to how this path comes to be. It's a really winding path for most of us. And I came from a biomedical background. My PhD was in basic sciences, islet biology, but really grounded within Indigenous health and early onset type 2 diabetes among First Nations youth. So it was a natural flow for me to kind of get into policy because so many of the policies that are in place today are really contributing to health inequities that we see day to day and we're trying to understand in a lab, but sometimes it's impossible to get at the true answer in a lab and we need to go outside the lab. So that's what I did. And I was still am on a lot of boards and committees. I jumped into science policy through things like the Chief Science Advisors, Youth Council, which I was on the first council, and I know Mian and others have taken over that role. So congratulations. It's a great place to start in the science policy world. I'm also on boards for Research Canada, another advocacy organization for research within Canada, as well as just different ones like the Native Biodata Consortium and things that are close to my heart. And I think that's another way that folks can kind of enter into the science policy or health policy world in a different way that might be outside of your direct research. But for me, it was what led me to the path I'm on right now. So definitely follow those kind of unique passion projects or interests. And I know that the fellowship that you referenced is postponed, the MyTax one. I would encourage, there is the Health Systems Impact Fellowship now running, and I would recommend, at least for folks in their doctorate or postdoctoral fellow, or even ECR now, to look into ECR as early career researcher, to look into that fellowship as a potential avenue for integrating your interests with science or health policy. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much. And Arthi, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm joining from Montreal, where Mian is as well. First of all, super happy to be here as someone who actually started my policy journey with Science and Policy Exchange. It's nice to kind of be back here and just see how much the organization has grown. And of course, we have such wonderful panelists with us today as well. So my name is Arthi Ramachandran. My background is in Arctic microbiology, studying bacteria in the Arctic Ocean and how they evolve and adapt to climate change. I'm actually only defending in 2 weeks from now. So even though I have kind of started a full career, I actually have not defended my PhD. So don't feel bad if you're in a similar path. It happens, and sometimes you just have to say yes to fun and unique opportunities that present themselves. So my journey into science policy started, like I said, with SPE. I also joined a lot of different groups like the Canadian Commission for UNESCO's Youth Advisory Group. And then, like Shweta, I did the MyTax Science Policy Fellowship and started working at Natural Resources Canada at the Office of the Chief Scientist as a policy analyst there. Worked for a bit, actually went on maternity leave for a bit, came back, went to the Office of the Chief Science Advisor's office for a secondment, and actually left my secondment early to pursue a different path where I now work for a nonprofit organization called Arctic Base Camp, which basically is about speaking science to power, advocating for Arctic and how those links are really related to global change and global risks. And I work actually very closely with the World Economic Forum on a lot of different projects. So, my path has kind of gone in many different ways. I think, if you open yourself up to opportunities, apply to different things, sometimes fun stuff really pop out in places that you don't expect. And so I think all of us have had this really winding career where we started off thinking, we were going to be in kind of that research science sphere, but found out that maybe there are other places that needed our talents a bit more. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, Chelsea Johnson was unable to join today, but we hope she's doing okay. So with that, we invite you as participants to submit questions in the chat throughout the event. Please remember to keep this a safe space and to be respectful. So we encourage you to promote dialogue with fellow colleagues and aspiring science policy folks. Donc, nous vous invitons à poser les questions en français ou en anglais à votre guise, puis je traduirai les questions en anglais pour les panélistes au besoin. Sinon, je vous invite à vous rapporter au rapport qui sera rédigé par la suite. So let's dive into it. Can you tell us about your day-to-day and your roles and responsibilities for those of us who might be less familiar with science policy, for those of us who might be graduate students dabbling into alternative careers to academia? Can you just tell us a little bit more about what science policy means to you? So let's start with you, Shweta Bibi.
Yeah, sure. So I think I've held two distinct positions in the field of science policy, and they've been quite different from each other. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each, just so you get to see a little bit of range. Because the thing is that my understanding, having sort of worked now for about 4 years in science policy, is that the landscape is still very much being defined, right, in real time. It's not as though things are all, set in stone at this point. There are a lot of different types of jobs. So my first job in science policy was with a not-for-profit, which was the Canadian Science Policy Center. And when I joined the center back in 2019, we were three employees, one of whom was the CEO and the president. I was the program manager, and then we had a kind of a secretary to the president. So that was sort of the staff, right? And so as program manager, I did a whole range of things. CSPC, one of the biggest things that it organizes is the Science Policy Conference, usually held in November in Ottawa. And there's a whole lot of kind of logistics that goes into planning that conference, planning the schedule. There are several volunteer committees that CSPC has, about 50 plus 50 to 80 volunteers. And so as program manager, I was kind of managing the committees that were run by volunteers. I wasn't leading those committees, but I had oversight over the whole thing. And if there were ever any gaps, because these are volunteers, and volunteer is a big word in the world of science policy. A lot of people end up volunteering their time first in this field to gain experience and then get the kinds of jobs that they're looking for. And so I myself started as a CSPC volunteer. And I was somehow at the right time, at the right place, and I was offered this position just based on my volunteer work. Almost never happens, right? It was a dream I hadn't dared to dream. And I was a new immigrant to Canada at the time. So it was just, kind of came to me as a blessing, I would say. And then so as program manager, I was managing volunteer committees. I was supporting the CEO whenever he had any kind of speaking engagements or writing engagements, things like that. I was supporting that. I was coming up with a new kind of direction for the center in terms of offerings, workshops for students, and workshops for science policy fellows and things like that. So it was a very wide range of responsibilities. And in a period of 1 year, I learned so much in that role. Every day was chaotic, every day was different. There was always the conference that was going to happen, and then there were other things. There was a longer term project with the workshops. There was developing actually also a new business model for CSPC to onboard partners, and all of that is actually on the website now. So I feel really, gratified that I had some role to play in that. And then there were the volunteers who would meet, it's 5, 6 different committees meeting, at least once a week, and then I had oversight over those meetings. So every day was, varied, in terms of what I did. Sometimes there were last minute things, like it's a small center, and this happens a lot at small centers. Something will come up, some fantastic new opportunity that will derail everything. And so it's like, oh my God, we have the opportunity to interview Minister Baines. Minister Baines at the time was our minister. And so it's like, okay, drop everything, drop the newsletter, drop, whatever you're doing for the conference, and let's, get some questions together. And, so it was just very exciting and fast paced and varied. And then in contrast, when I joined NSERC as a science policy fellow, NSERC is federal government. Bureaucracy moves at a much slower pace than something like a small nonprofit, right? So a very different experience. And even within the bureaucracy, NSERC is an agency, it's not a core department. So it's about 500 people strong. So the nature of an agency of that size can actually be very different from, a huge, department like I think Aarti has worked at Natural Resources. That is a completely different beast. And so when I joined NSERC, I joined as a policy analyst. And so I joined as part of a team that was called Policy and International Relations, and I worked in international relations with no experience in international relations or hardcore sort of policy, right? I have a degree in chemistry, but I grew up in India. I did my undergraduate and master's in chemistry there. And then I went to the United States, and that's where I did my PhD. At the University of Maryland, and then I moved to Canada. And so, I may not have had international relations experience in an academic context, but I certainly had international experience, which I brought to my work. And so the big kind of objective of my work as policy analyst was to facilitate international collaborations for NSERC with other agencies in other countries so that our researchers in Canada can then, have research projects with researchers in other countries. That was sort of the big aim, and my kind of like sort of narrower role within that as policy analyst was to pretty much, it was like doing a literature review. If I kind of correlate it to, graduate student life, often I would be asked, for instance, I'd be told, we need to organize this workshop, let's say, with the European Union on quantum, with our researchers on one side and theirs on another. Whom are we going to invite from Canada? And so then we had this whole sort of rubric, which included things like equity, diversity, and inclusion elements, right? So we would see, okay, who are our quantum researchers? Where is the database? How can we have balance in terms of having researchers from all over, represented from all over Canada, BIPOC researchers, and so on. Things like that I would be asked to pull, and I would report that type of thing, those recommendations to my supervisor, who would then make up the actual advice. As I grew in my role at NSERC, I continued to work in international relations and also took on some other policy files. But essentially, going from analyst to advisor, now I have to do a lot more than gather information and analyze it and organize it. I now have to synthesize it into advice, which often means taking into account information that is not readily available anywhere in writing. So there is actually a very crucial information gathering step, which has a lot to do with basically talking to people, increasing your awareness and knowledge of the landscape that you're operating in by essentially being very well connected to all of the stakeholders in that ecosystem. So that would mean, of course, people within your own team and organization, but also then people within the federal government, people, whoever you basically collaborate with in your work. So for us at NSERC, our sort of core stakeholders are Canadian researchers at universities, colleges, CEGEPs, and other institutes. So here we're talking, of course, about the PIs, the primary investigators, but also their students, their postdocs, and that whole range. So being very plugged into that ecosystem, being very plugged into the tri-agencies, SHRC, CIHR, and so on, being plugged into all the relevant federal agencies, Global Affairs Canada, since this is international relations, we work with them, of course, ICED, and then our international collaborators in the various countries where we do collaborate. And so a lot of information comes from how should I say, not informal sources. These are formal sources, but indirect sources, right? Like you're given a complex question, and then you have to go and gather information, add that to the analysis. Of course, there's existing databases of information that you also take into account, and then you formulate some advice, and then you also critique your own advice for whoever is like the layer above you who's trying to make a decision. So then you tell them, okay, this is my advice, but I think, this is the best thing to do. If we do this, these are the pros and cons. If we do that, these are the pros and cons. Here are a few options for you. So that's the sort of, nature of the briefs that I would prepare, for example. So I hope that gives you a little flavor of the work.
Thank you so much. I think we're already seeing how science policy can be very varied. So Taylor, can you tell us a bit more about what you do and how health policy can also be included in science policy?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. And I think when I'm still in research. So I'm a postdoctoral fellow, and I'm still technically a researcher. And I don't think the worlds of science policy and research are mutually exclusive. Rather, I think they're very much intertwined. And I think that we're just not trained properly as, scientists and researchers throughout our education on really what is science policy. Part of the reason for joining so many committees on science policy was because I wanted to know what it was. And that was some of our first initial conversations that we held with, the chief science advisors, youth council, with various other councils that I've been on, is like, what do we mean when we're talking about science policy, and what does it mean in this context? And what does it mean in a different context? And then what is science? And it can go really granular like that. But I think in my day-to-day, as I mentioned, I'm in research. I'm in the field of Indigenous data sovereignty right now. And for those who have no idea what I'm talking about when I talk about Indigenous data sovereignty, it is really the right for First Nations and Indigenous peoples across Canada and the world to have ownership over their own data. And that encompasses all forms of data. And so when you're thinking about health data, when you're thinking about lands and waters, when you're thinking about, in my case, I have a really strong interest in biological sampling and the clinical work that's being done as it relates to First Nations and who owns that data and how is that data used and who profits and all of the things that come with the research ecosystem. And then how does that interface with health policy and science policy and those who are making the decisions with that data? And so, again, when I'm thinking about science policy and health policy and how it intersects with research, for me, it's really the day-to-day. It is thinking about going through things that I should have no business going through, health legislation, government policies, understanding how these really nitty-gritty details written within these policies are influencing and impacting health outcomes for Indigenous peoples. And for me, that is more of a necessity than it is a desire to be involved in health policy. I think it's just inseparable in the way that so many of the policies that are still in existence, the Indian Act, which is still in effect today, how these things affect our people. And that is, again, not by wanting to understand the words that are found within that policy, but having to for the sake of trying to change health systems. So I did, as I mentioned, develop a lot of this interest, or whatever you want to call it, off the side of my desk. And I think a lot of this work during, as I got involved in my PhD and now continue to work in the space in my postdoc, was kind of off the side of my desk in the sense of we're not well supported to do this work. Not only is there really few formal training opportunities in understanding what science policy is, but there's also few support systems out there, whether that's your supervisor, that's the mentors, that's your institution. I come from Manitoba and the University of Manitoba, and we don't have science policy networks or anything like that. So it can feel really isolating. And again, not really understanding how to get started in this space. So as I said, I kind of jumped into certain things that I thought would help me clarify what is science policy and how does it shape, our outcomes today. And I was fortunate to kind of go through these experiences and continue to serve on various boards and advocate. And I think what became clear to me is that some of the best science policy folks I know are still researchers, and their day-to-day is still that really on the bench science for some, or community-based research for some, and who can bring that experience to the policy tables. Because again, we're seeing a complete underfunding of science, especially basic sciences, which is my background. And I think, there's a lot of people to blame in that space, but I also think, the basic scientists and the folks who are doing that work with the proper training and understanding with science policy and coming to those tables and being heard at those tables is also really important. So I think it really requires everyone to have a basic understanding of science policy in order to create a space in a research ecosystem that we all want to work within. So I think that's kind of my day-to-day. with science policy. It's hit or miss whether, you know, I'm on so many different things and pulled in so many different directions, as many of us are, especially folks who are, you know, Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, just so many different opportunities that pull at our heartstrings because we know they're affecting our communities and we want to be involved and we want to make the changes that we want to see. And yet, you know, sometimes we're unsupported in that work, or we feel, you know, isolated in that work. But I think events like this can help us come together and see that we're not so alone. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Finally, Arthi, what can you tell us about your roles and responsibilities at the moment?
Yeah, so yeah, like both Taylor and Shweta, like I guess the roles in science policy are so fluid in some ways. I think a really big aspect of science policy is really science translation. And you know, that idea of bringing knowledge to someone in a way that's understandable, that's not just here are some graphs that you might not understand, or here are some words that I'm using that you know, don't make any sense to you. So I think it's really taking the science and grounding it and translating it to the people that you're working with, whatever stakeholder that might be. It might be a minister, it might be another advisor, it might be a community member, it might be a friend, it might be a family member, but just being able to understand, how do I best communicate this to them in a way that's meaningful and impactful as well. So when I started working at NRCan, a lot of the work I was doing involved, you know, putting together kind of open science action plans as the government was moving forward with their open science roadmap. So talking a lot to our scientists within NRCan, asking them, you know, what are some of the problems you're facing in terms of open science? Like, we still put a lot of emphasis on having to publish in places such as Nature and Science, which are not open. But now if the government is saying you need to make all of your publications open, you kind of lose out on those higher profile journals. And so what does that mean for your career progression? What does that mean for your research moving forward? And I think there were a lot more questions than answers, to be honest, that came out of this. And I think that's also a big part of science policy is really understanding what are the right questions we should be asking, because sometimes we might be just, you know, making policies or putting together things that don't actually help the people they're meant to. And so I think really learning to do proper stakeholder engagement, whether that's like, you know, within science communities or Indigenous communities or anywhere, to really understand that there's this meaningful relationship and partnership that you need to develop, which is maybe not a skill that I personally had during my PhD, but something that I definitely still strive to get better at. And I think that's also a really important part of this. I also worked on, you know, how do we make the promotion process within NRCan science community more equitable to all people from different backgrounds, different science backgrounds, as well as different, you know, race backgrounds, different community backgrounds, and things like that. And so how do we make sure that everyone's properly represented? So that was really interesting. And then when I started working at the Office of the Chief Science Advisor, I was really focused on incorporating science into disaster risk reduction and emergency management. And that's where I really learned that not all of the government departments and agencies really talk to each other. We work a lot in silos, but have this idea we're all part of this bigger government, but we're not really great at communicating, especially in an emergency situation. So trying to understand, okay, how does the science within all of these different departments and agencies, how do we bring that together so we go forward with a you know, a strong, cohesive message, rather than one department saying one thing, the other department maybe saying something slightly different, and then decision makers being completely confused as to what to do, or and you know, being kind of paralyzed with these decisions that are really difficult, and people are advising them differently. So it was really interesting to learn about that process, about Canada's emergency management programs, and you know, how to properly incorporate science into that. And I think we're getting there slowly, and there's lots of interest in really pushing that forward. But of course, government moves slow. And so sometimes it is kind of push and pull when you're trying to change something. And all the while I was doing all of these different things, I was also, part of different committees, different boards. I went to the COP27 UNFCCC meeting in Egypt through an organization called ICCI, so it's the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, which is something I just kind of randomly came across on the internet. Someone had posted something on Twitter, I think, and I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. They're taking early career researchers there. Let me just apply. Sounds like a fun experience. So I applied and I got to go, and that was one of the experiences of being in this really large international space with all of these like climate negotiators. And I was definitely overwhelmed, confused, and also just really excited to be there. And I think I learned a lot of what are the kind of international global conversations happening, and how are they incorporating science into all of this, especially given the climate crisis that we're currently in. And while I was there, I realized, a lot of it came down to the bottom line of finance, money. What's the bottom line? Who's making money? Who's not making money? And it was really a lot of financial conversations. And so that kind of made me a little bit confused as to my role in all of this. And so when I got back, I actually got this other opportunity to go to the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, which is another really big meeting. And there, climate is talked about a lot, but you also have people flying in on their private jets. And so it's a very weird, different experience. And through there, I was there with this organization, Arctic Base Camp, who I now work for. And I kind of learned a little bit about how to talk about climate science and science policy in a financial sphere, which I think is really important because right now, some of the largest emitters, some of the largest corporations are the ones that we need to change. And if we understand how to speak to them, then I think there's potential for, transformative change. And so that's why I ended up working for this organization when I got an offer from them to do this, to talk to, CEOs via like really people that I never would have had the chance to otherwise, to try to convince them, hey, this climate crisis, it affects you. What's happening in the Arctic is linked to global risks across the world. We need to do something right now. And that's what I'm doing currently. And I think it's a really enriching and interesting experience that I never would have gotten had I not said yes to a lot of other smaller experiences along the way, or had I not just applied for things that I thought looked really interesting. And so I think one thing I learned is to just put myself out there, and it's okay if I get rejected, but if I don't try, then, I'll never actually get a chance. There's no harm in trying. And so I think that was like a really big message for me, is just try, and whatever happens, happens, but at least you did your best. And so right now I think that's kind of my current career path. And, after this is done, maybe I'll go back to the government, maybe I'll go somewhere else. I have no idea. I think it's just this open path that I'm, just trying to see where the next place that I can go to make the most impact that I can potentially do. So yeah, I think that's it for me for now.
Thank you so much for sharing, to the three of you. And I think this gives us an excellent overview of what science policy can offer as a field. So my next question would be, how have your background and origins helped you in your professional career? How can one use this background and these origins as strength? And how do you navigate this space as a BIPOC person, and we can say it, as a woman? So maybe Taylor, do you want to start? I think you've already started with mentioning that it was part of your interest, even if it could be despite yourself, that you want to advocate for your community. So maybe do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. And I think, not to say that everyone doesn't come to science policy for love of policy, but I think in many cases it is a desire to see change, and it's sometimes a frustration and just this constant tension with your day-to-day, if you're in a lab or if you're, whatever your work is bringing you, and you just can't make those changes and you're running up to those barriers and you're like, why isn't this going anywhere? And for me, that was the shortcomings of those existing policies. And for, seeing that academic biomedical research in this case wasn't able to take us to that next step. Obviously, it is essential. Obviously, we need adequate funding and resources for that type of research, but we also need to make sure that we're talking and engaging with policymakers and the folks who are pulling the strings, the funding agencies, the hospital administration, everybody, so that we know that the changes that we want to see are actually going to become effective. So that really brings us into that policy sphere. And I think, as I said, as a First Nations scholar, most of that had to evolve by necessity. And I think if Indigenous folks are listening to this, it doesn't matter your path, your educational path, your career path, what you're in right now. I think regardless of your degree field, you're often an expert in policy by necessity. You have to understand your lived experience of these impositions of different systems, the federal, provincial jurisdictions that regulate our healthcare systems, the policies that affect our day-to-day lives as Indigenous peoples, are really just over encompassing. And I think as an Indigenous person living in this federal state, having to understand those policies really intimately and bringing those into your work is one way that you can incorporate, health policy or science policy into your work. So not being afraid to bring that lived experience into that, whatever your career paths are. I think for myself, because of those interests, because of that nagging feeling that I wasn't doing enough, or that the work that I was doing was just going to be published and kind of put away, and that frustration, I tried to go out a little bit further. And again, for one of the things that I wanted to do was to review the research that was happening within our region. So all of the research that pertains to First Nations, if you're familiar with university research ethics boards, they'll have a review process and they'll have standards and processes that you have to abide by. But what are the First Nations processes for research, and how do we make sure that research is incorporating principles of our wellness and respecting our community-based protocols? So I initially had applied to something called the Health Information Research Governance Committee, which was, again, all these acronyms, but HIRG, which is the First Nations Research Ethics Board within Manitoba. And that allowed me to see not only the scope of research that's happening within our region, but also to exert anytime you can find a little bit of, places to exert power or places to exert your voice is a really great space to be in. And so that was one of those opportunities where, reviewing that research, being able to have a say in the ethical protocols and being introduced to so many folks in that space who are doing the same allowed me to really see the path that I wanted to take, and incorporating those different expertise really into the path that I'm on now. So that actually HIRG is supported by my current employer, the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba. So again, it was all through relationships really, and that's often how Indigenous work happens is through relationships and finding ways to get involved. That it started with a committee that was maybe meeting 4 times a year. And now it's my full-time job engaging in that space and taking that little bit of, power that I had there. And then now I have this entire new position and being able to have a voice, a really strong voice at a really strong organization who's advocating for community health. So it can start in small places and build up. And I think, again, bringing that lived experience and bringing those little small pieces together to influence what you want to do long term, or how, and again, that can change. I'm not saying that my career path isn't going to change again. These things often wind, but bringing those little pieces together along your journey and kind of sitting down and reflecting on what really was the most impactful to you can help you kind of find your path. So that's kind of how my background, my different interests, how they kind of started to align into the position that I'm in now. And I'm so happy. I just can't say that because I think when we're going through our academic degrees or your master's or your undergrad, like it's exhausting, it's tiring, you feel like you're never going to get out of it, and then when you do, you're already burnt out and you just don't see that that path for you right away. And I think just knowing that there is different opportunities and that you can find things that you want to do, and still, if you want to still do research and just find ways to incorporate science policy into your work or incorporate your lived experiences into your work, because that's, again, some of the most impactful things that I've seen personally.
Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to hear that you're happy.
I hope we're all happy. I honestly...
Shita, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Okay, so this resonated very deeply with me. I think I'm going to just go by what Taylor said about, bringing your lived experiences. Um, to answer your question of how that helped me in my professional career, that is where the drive comes from. And so I just have a different example to present of the same sort of concept. So when I was in grad school, I had someone who was a couple of years senior to me who kind of gathered us all in the sort of conference room and said, "Hey guys, do you know that there aren't a lot of jobs for us out there, and we're being trained we're trained well for chemistry, but our lens for what we could be doing once we graduate is so narrow right now." That we really should take matters into our own hands and do something about it. And so we formed a bit of like a student government, and we started organizing these types of events, basically inviting speakers, inviting alumni, trying to convince the department that they should give us, I don't know, very, very a few $100s to organize these events so that we could have coffee and cookies and bring people in, things like that, and also to create a bit of a culture where PIs wouldn't hold it against their students if they were to go to these types of events during business hours, right? So that's how it all started for me, and it actually became a real passion project, something I then started writing papers on. And I'll share a link of one of the studies that I did, and it was basically about career outcomes for PhDs. And that is essentially what I became passionate about when I was in grad school. And it was one of those kind of meta things where like it was a problem that, of course, impacted me, but I knew that it impacted others. And I felt like I was on to something and that I needed to amplify this issue. And I graduated in 2017, and that was in the United States. And since then, there have been several reports in the US and Canada on this particular topic, and essentially about how, training in academia, the culture in academia can be sometimes almost restrictive and unfairly judgmental about folks who go on to do other types of very meaningful and very impactful work instead of actually being supportive, so that society can benefit from all of these highly trained and passionate folks. So that was sort of the issue that I was interested in. And, this is the paper that I wrote. I'm going to just put it in the chat. That's how it started for me. But, when did I start working on that paper and when did I actually land a job in science policy? There's many years of difference in that. And there's a lot of volunteer work. What helped me, and in terms of my own background as, a woman who is of Indian origin, who is working in science policy in Canada. And when I came to Canada, I hadn't studied here. And I had moved to Toronto, and things were so competitive that I was getting rejected from volunteer activities. Like, that's just how difficult it was at that point. And for me personally, it was the Canadian Science Policy Centre that made a huge difference. And that organization is also headed by a BIPOC individual, is also full of women and other BIPOC folks who make the space inclusive. And this is like standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Folks who had done a lot of this work before and created this the center or this system that I was able to then come into and really benefit from. And then, I'm of course trying to, pay it forward and mentor others on their journey in the field of science policy. So that, like, being a woman, how has that helped me or hindered me? I think it has helped me to connect with other women, and so many brilliant, women. It's just an easier connection for me sometimes. In both directions, I have mentors and champions who are women, and then I have certainly, had the privilege of also sharing my experience with women who are entering into science policy and other BIPOC folks as well. I think I do I just do this because I enjoy it, and I feel like I have something to offer, and I benefited from it when I needed it. And so I'm always open to talking to folks, and it so happens when I do this passively, it so happens that it is BIPOC folks who reach out to me. And I'm delighted to say that, like, several people whom I've been talking to for years now, for 2, 3 years, have now finally kind of landed the kinds of positions that they wanted to. They feel like they have a footing. They're now mentoring others, and it's just a wonderful thing. So that's what has benefited me. But since your question was about backgrounds and how things have benefited you, I also want to talk about privilege here. Uh, you know, I I may have struggled to get a position in science policy or even just my first job here in Canada, but I still had a degree that was well recognized. It was from the United States. I have several people in my circle who have degrees from countries like India, which are not as well recognized sometimes. They may be just as smart, just as rigorous, etc. But there are so many unconscious and conscious biases that we all have to contend with in this space. And so that's definitely been a privilege. When I applied for that science policy fellowship, I know that degree from that institution in that particular field made a difference. And then, in terms of other privileges, I think I certainly found champions along the way. My first supervisor at NSERC was a huge, champion for me, not just a mentor. Like, he did not just tell me, oh, if you do this, attend this talk or join this committee or do this thing. It wasn't limited to that. It also extended to introducing me to folks and saying, hey, you should talk to this person. And so it so happened that this person was a very, very senior person. And you'll find that sometimes very, very senior people are actually very generous with their mentorship. I feel like especially BIPOC folks, they've seen so much. Things get very, very lonely. I think once folks hit that mid-senior management level, I've heard from my BIPOC mentors that it gets very, very challenging, because it starts tapering like that. If there are, so many BIPOC folks at my level, it just tapers up like that as people rise through the ranks, and it gets lonely. And it is people like that who've helped me along, and it is a privilege to have encountered them and to have been able to convey to them, that I'm worthy of their time. So yeah, I think those are some points I wanted to make.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience and some difficult times that you might have experienced as well. And I think it's wonderful to hear about how you're mentoring others and moving it along. And I think we can come back to that notion later. And Arthi, finally.
I mean, everything that Taylor and Shweta said really rings true just across the board. Speaking of privilege, I'm first generation, so my parents came here, and being, I guess, born a Canadian definitely gave me a lot of privileges and advantages that others do not have, especially when applying to jobs like in the Canadian government, where, they ask, oh, if you get first choice, if you're a Canadian citizen, then a permanent resident, and then maybe we'll like consider you potentially, but like really don't bother wasting your time. And we have so much talent coming in from just globally, from everywhere, that we're not taking advantage of, in a good way, of course. Right? We have so much just amazing people coming in, and and then they're stuck because they can't apply to so many things, whether it's fellowships, research grants, government positions, or jobs in general. There's this kind of hard stop of like, oh, well, too bad. You better luck next time. And I think that that's definitely very difficult, especially for, BIPOC people that were, disadvantaged in those ways, especially, if you're coming with a degree from the global South, it's not well recognized in Canada. Whereas if you come in from like a European degree or a US degree, they're like, please come in. And so I definitely see those barriers are there. And that lends to us having less diversity, less understanding of different perspectives, less understanding of different backgrounds and different ways of living and ways of knowing, that we can really all come together. We're here, for example, trying to solve, the climate crisis, and we're all in this together. We only have one planet. Something that happens in the Arctic is going to affect someone in Kiribati, for example, right? We should all be working together, but we put up these silos and these walls that prevent us from allowing to actually do that. And it's really unfortunate. So I think trying to break that down is definitely something that I've always been advocating for. I try to make sure that when I'm in spaces, to create something that's really inclusive of all different types of backgrounds, different education backgrounds, different ways of living, different ways of knowing. I think we can all benefit from learning from each other, and, empathy takes you a long way. And so I've been, really privileged to have great mentors who were very open to me doing things outside of my PhD, outside of my work, letting me take time off to go to COP27, encouraging me to do these different things. And, they were, some were BIPOC, some were not. And I've been privileged that I had that opportunity, that I didn't work with people who were trying to stop me from growing. And so I definitely, like Shweta said, like people before me kind of paved that path, so I didn't have to necessarily suffer. And my talents were recognized, and so I am very lucky and fortunate that that was the case. And so like Taylor and Shweta, I do try to do my best to pass that on to others. By mentoring, by just providing different opportunities, just being there to help, even just being there to listen, because sometimes it's hard, and so you just want to vent to someone who understands what you're talking about and is not just saying, oh well, too bad, or like it's just suck it up, but rather like, oh, I do understand these problems. And I think that having that kind of environment has been really important for me, and I hope that I can also provide that for others. So I think as all of us continue to help mentor others and help provide these more inclusive spaces where we can grow together, hopefully we move away from places that push people down and try to stop people from rising and try to stop new ideas and diverse ideas to move forward. And so I think we're all doing a really great job with what we have. And so just thank you guys for the amazing work that you've been doing.
Thank you. So time is running. So for the next few questions, we'll try to stick it to maybe 2 to 3 minutes per answer. But on that note, Arthi, what are the obstacles or challenges you have had to face to land and work in your position? Have there been instances that you've heard or that you've been a victim of, discrimination, or have you seen any instances of tokenism? Do you feel imposter syndrome? Have you felt it, and how do you overcome it? And so I wanted to talk about these obstacles to rising, as you put it. So since you usually are the last one to answer, Arthi, do you want to go ahead first this time?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll try to keep it short. Like I said, I've been quite privileged. Yes, there have been times where I've seen tokenism happen, where I've seen, people being promoted because, they were able to always go to that 5 set after hours that, other people might not have been able to go to, or the supervisor sees themselves in this person, whether or not that's conscious or unconscious. People promote or spend more time mentoring those who they feel reflected in. And so I've and especially in academia, I did see quite a lot of that. I was lucky in the sense that my supervisor was never like that and was very open and inclusive. And I think most of his lab members are female, just by no reason really, other than I think just chance. But he's always been super inclusive. And so while I didn't have to face that, I definitely saw it happening around me. And I did try my best to be there to support those people and say, you know, it's not your fault, or sometimes it's better to cut your losses and move on to somewhere else where you're appreciated, and that you don't have to stay in a toxic environment. And it's not okay to be treated this way, that it's not normal. And I think it's important to tell people that, especially when they're in a situation it's hard to see outside. And so to be able to say, it's not you, you should go somewhere else where you're appreciated because you're doing amazing work, I think goes a long way. So for me, I think that was really important, is just to be able to be there for others and have these open conversations about, you know, privilege, toxicity, tokenism, and salary. You know, that's a big thing, right? Just having open conversations about how much I was making. My previous tax fellow who came before me told me exactly how much she was making, so that when I went to the negotiating table, that I knew what her salary was and I could advocate for myself. And I know for a fact that they were trying to give me a lower salary. And so had I not been like, I know exactly what she's making, I would have taken an offer that was not reflective of my skills. So I think that's really important as well. But I will leave it to my other panelists to continue this.
Thank you. Taylor, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, no, everything that you just you just said is so important. The barriers can feel really insurmountable, and I think as we're going through it, we don't really know, or you know, you can't see the forest for the trees. It's hard. And I think as you kind of move out of those spaces and you look back and you reflect, like take that time to reflect on those obstacles and those barriers, because they won't change unless we really voice them and we bring them into bring them into visibility. And I think as we move forward in our careers, what's really helpful is having that little bit more power and privilege and ways to exercise that change. And I think staying committed to that, not, you know, I think it's really true that if a place is toxic and, you know, the environment is toxic, you know, knowing yourself and knowing your value and knowing when you're need to get out of there for your own safety. But also for places that, you know, where can we exert change so that the next generation has an easier path. And I think, you know, now that I'm in a place that is a First Nations led, First Nations owned, completely aligns with our protocols, is grounded within our culture, is grounded within so many beautiful teachings, that is the place for me. That is the environment where I thrive. And that might not be the same for everybody, obviously, but finding that environment that is conducive to the way that you know, can work and live in a happy place, and that you're valued and that your opinions are heard. And that is, it's hard to find, but once you find it, you know it. And it really makes all the difference. So, but also now that I'm in this position, going back and advocating and realizing what wasn't wrong, or realizing what was wrong, and making those changes and advocating on the boards that I'm on. You know, I sit on boards with CIHR, I sit on boards with Research Canada, and being able to go and have an influence on training strategies in the Canadian research landscape right now is huge. As going through it, having seen the tokenism, the racism, the, you know, all the things that go unreported because the university systems are so terrible at making action, being able to go back now and have an influence on those training strategies is something that I'm really happy that I'm able to have a voice in. But I think sometimes it's easier to just walk away. And I would encourage folks, you know, just write it down, bring it, make sure that you're not letting it slide, and maybe keep it in your pocket for later, but knowing that those obstacles and those barriers, other people are facing them too. And collectively, we have to make a change as we move forward in our careers.
Thank you. Finally, Shrita, any obstacles or challenges that have not yet been mentioned?
Not yet been mentioned. Okay.
possible.
I will point to one that I am starting to notice more and more now, in the role that I'm in. So I will say that NSERC has been a welcoming organization to me. The way Taylor described, being where you feel like you belong, where you can really express yourself and, bring your, all parts, the multifaceted aspects of your identity to your work. I feel that way with my team in my organization. But I also work in a very collaborative environment. And so, sometimes I'm designated with a certain level of authority by my supervisor, and then I go into another external meeting with collaborators, and perhaps I don't look like the type of person who would have that kind of authority sometimes. Maybe I don't look like someone who has the kind of, scientific training that I do, whatever. And I get those sort of first impressions, that sometimes the kinds of unconscious biases that people have, it comes through, and it's not a great feeling. And you know, that is an obstacle, and I'm figuring out how to navigate that. Um, it is what all BIPOC people do. We work really hard. We try to excel. We try to be good at what we do, and we hope that the systems will kind of register that and let us do our best work. So that's as far as I've gone. But I will say that there have been specific instances where someone like my supervisor or someone more senior to me has advocated for me, and perhaps they had more privilege and they were not BIPOC and they were also more senior, and so they didn't have to say much, but a little went a long way. And so I will say that what I've learned from that is whenever I have an inch of privilege, I will use it to do that, because it makes such a huge difference. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the three of you, for all of you, for sharing your experience with us and your background and all of these insights into the science policy field. So with that, the panel would come to an end. So we have one question in the chat. If you have any more questions, please do leave them in the chat so I can ask them to our panelists. But here's the question. Can you all please share an example of a skill you've actively worked on improving to enhance your effectiveness in your present role? So is there anybody who would like to go first?
Go first, if that's fine. So I think for me, something that I've actively worked on is writing. So writing in a non-scientific manner, and writing concisely. I feel like we're very good at run-on sentences and adding in a lot of words and adjectives and data points that might not be necessarily useful for getting the message across. So that's definitely something I've been working on improving, is how do I, translate that science to policy or to business or to general public or to whichever audience I'm trying to reach. Put myself in their shoes. What is the most important thing that they want to learn from this? What makes the most impact for them? And then trying to make sure that I translate that without, of course, losing the integrity of the science behind it. But I think that's definitely something that I've been working on actively.
Thank you. Shita, Taylor, do you want to chime in on a particular skill that you think is necessary for science policy work?
Sure. Taylor, do you mind if I go ahead? I think for me, it's relationship building. When I think of myself in my first year of grad school, I had just moved from India to the United States. Everything seemed so daunting. And I'm here now in a space where my work, to a great extent, depends on the relationships that I have and then the knowledge that I can build through that. Like I alluded to this earlier, that, the kinds of knowledge that I need to access are not published anywhere. They come from talking to people. And so those relationships, and then having the confidence to approach people and, work on building those relationships, that is something I have actively worked on. And I'm really proud of where I've come, at least since I was in the first year of grad school. I feel I'm much more confident now. I much more understand how to relate to a wider variety of people, obstacles and all notwithstanding.
Thank you. Taylor?
Yeah, I would say something along the similar lines. And I don't know if it's a skill per se, but learning how to, kind of broker different environments and how to translate across different environments. And part of that is just knowing how the systems work. So really investing my time in understanding how different systems that seem really like unapproachable from the outside, who's actually pulling the strings and who's actually, who do you need to talk to within those organizations or systems. And that takes a lot of time. There's no easy blueprint to say like, this is how you need to affect change within this organization that you don't even know where to start. So that was something that I think just investing, learning, really being open to other, folks who are already further along in their careers than me, and having those mentors. And also, I think it's, again, not really a skill, but learning to say no, learning where to invest my time, where to invest my energy, where to, what environments align with what I want to do, and then trying to streamline anything that was, external to that. Because again, as an Indigenous person being pulled in a lot of different directions, it's really easy to for things to get out of hand. So knowing what is my priority and staying true to myself and my values.
Absolutely. Another question that we got: do you believe the skills you have gained in your PhD were necessary for your work in science policy? And if so, which ones? So who wants to go first?
Go first. Oh, sorry, everybody.
Sorry, we all unmuted at the same time. Taylor, go ahead.
I'm still in research, so I absolutely. I think, we're trained. I was trained on the bench as biomedical basic science. Obviously, I'm not doing mouse dissections these days, but I think a lot of the same skills of understanding, again, these intricate systems within the body or within the, diabetes processes, or understanding where the samples and things go, and then bringing that out, right? So I started at the level of like genetics and very granular understandings, and then consistently contextualizing that within the larger systems. And then eventually that brought me to policy, right? So I had to affect change within, as the circles kind of grow bigger. But I think the skills of, whatever the skills you are, there's so many skills you learn in a PhD, like writing, like communicating, having confidence in yourself is also like having, going through that process to be the best version of yourself. I think it's a really transformative time. So all of those soft skills, I'm not sure, I hate that word too, but I'm not sure what we're using these days, but all of those skills that kind of make you the person you are after a graduate degree or any degree, is really, I think, helps to transform you into that kind of next version of yourself.
Shita?
Sure. So I work in policy for science, which means that the base that I or my organization caters to is the research community. And so my entire lived experience through grad school, it contributes to the work that I do. It informs all of my analyses. It adds depth to whatever, I see out there. So that for sure, that background is extremely, extremely helpful. Chemistry, there have been occasions where we've been talking about launching a call in a particular field of chemistry, and I've had the opportunity to do a little bit of research, and people are like, oh, what's green chemistry? And I get to tell people, oh, this is what it is. Very, very rare, like direct application of chemistry to my work, very rare these days. But that problem solving and just being so, like, having dealt with such complex research questions, everything else feels smaller. Like, I'm not trying to undermine complexity in my work, but I'm just saying that um, it's still always at level with what I've seen in research. I personally think research is the hardest thing to do. You're really going into the unknown at a very philosophical level. This is my opinion. And so I'm not so fazed by the problems that I see. I feel like if there is an analytical solution to it, I'll find it. Sometimes there's not, and then that's where the whole skill building happens in my new roles.
Arthi?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what both of them said. For me, my work was in Arctic science, and in some ways, working in the Arctic itself is, very like diplomatic area where you work with a lot of international scientists. But as well, for me, the most important part was working with communities and community engagement and understanding the impact of both the research as well as the types of questions being asked in those environments and how to best ensure that we're not recreating those colonial histories that is really entrenched in Arctic research, especially not even that long ago, really. So that was definitely like at the forefront of everything that I was kind of doing, and led me to this area of science policy, was that I wanted to make an impact outside of the basic research that I was doing. And right now I work as a polar science advisor. So, all of that science that I did do during my PhD is helping me now, especially like translating science into policy as well as like for businesses, et cetera. So I think for all of us, right, we gain these troubleshooting skills. We're kind of put in these intense environments. I think a PhD really tests your limits in a lot of ways. And we all learned and came out of it, I think, slightly stronger than before. And so I think that really helps. And, we're able to use our expertise in different ways, whether it's through, I guess, soft skills or hard skills or whatever we call them these days. I think we definitely have all different lived experiences through our PhDs that are very valuable.
Thank you. I do have a question here about mentorship. So how can one go about finding a mentor? How do you like to be approached? How can you write a cold email? Can you write a cold email to somebody? Any tips on networking in science policy and getting yourself out there? So I think you all touched upon it, but Arthi, do you want to start maybe?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, to all of those, I guess for me, I was lucky. Like, I mean, I was part of Science and Policy Exchange, and that really opens a lot of big networks for everyone, to be honest. And that was really helpful for me in terms of navigating the science policy sphere that I knew absolutely nothing about. And through there, I met a lot of really cool people that I then would just keep in touch with. And some of them were mentors, some of them were just acquaintances or contacts I would talk to every now and then. I have sent a couple of cold emails, I guess. And while it was a little bit scary at first, because I was like, oh no, like, what are they going to say? What are they going to think of me? In the end, I was like, the worst thing that's going to happen is that they either don't respond or they say, no, I don't have time for you. And those are both acceptable things sometimes. So I think you should definitely, if you find that someone's really interesting and you want to talk to them, please send them an email and just, I think if you can explain your passion for what they're doing in your words, it'll come through. And everyone really wants to talk. At least most people are open to talking to people who are passionate about the same things as them. And so I've always had, good experiences in that sense. So I think, like I said before, give it a shot. What's the worst that can happen?
Mm-hmm. Sheeta, as a mentor, can you provide some insight on this?
Sure. Okay. Where do I start? So yes, absolutely. I've sent so many cold emails and cold LinkedIn messages, and in a lot of cases it worked, in some cases it didn't, and that's fine. You really have to have a thick skin with these things. It's not personal. Sometimes people don't have time. I mean, I've done a lot of this. I'm usually very prompt at responding to people, but I'm currently on maternity leave, and that's not on my LinkedIn right now. And so I am ignoring a lot of messages, and I will get back to them, once I have the bandwidth. But usually if people have the time, and you approach them respectfully. I used to like to always request a 20-minute meeting, and I would always keep it to 20 minutes, even if it was going great. And then I would approach them again for another conversation, if it really did go well. On LinkedIn, when I reach out to people cold, there's a feature where you can add a little note. I think there's a character limit, but you can still say, introduce yourself and the why behind, why you're reaching out to them. Just say, I'm interested in this, and I was hoping I could chat with you for 20 minutes. If they accept your request, you can actually send them a longer email style message. There's always LinkedIn Premium, but it's horribly expensive. Um, and then when I was unemployed, I've tried that too, and it was very effective, even though it's horribly expensive. Um, Emails, I've even used the strategy of, if you have one person's email within the organization, that's the format everybody follows. So as long as you have a first name and a last name, I've even sent emails by guessing people's emails, and reached out in that way. And there's always a straightforward, simple ask, which is not anything, too demanding from them, respecting their time, being extremely well prepared, never asking questions which I could look up, by Googling, trying to ask questions for which that conversation actually, made a difference. So yeah, I think just approach people thoughtfully and respectfully, and don't take rejections personally. They are not rejections. People sometimes don't have the time, and no, that's okay.
Thank you for these really practical tips. Taylor, anything that you want to add?
I agree with all of that. I just would say on this, idea of mentorship and networking and everything, don't underestimate or don't undervalue your peer mentors. So folks who are still at the same stage as you. I think it helps to have diversity in your peer mentors. So, it's helpful to get involved in groups that have really folks from really different backgrounds, different career paths, different interests, different degrees, who don't have degrees, like to have really folks from all different walks of life, but are maybe at the same stage of you as you're trying to figure things out, because they can provide really strong perspectives and also really interesting opportunities within their own paths. And I think it's helpful to have those connections as you're going forward, because eventually, those are going to be the leaders, the CEOs, the folks who are hiring as well. And so I just don't undervalue those relationships. I think relationships are, one of the most important things when we're thinking about networking. And so many times we want to go to the top, we want to go to the, that person who has all that power and privilege right away. But I think investing your time and your energy in the folks around you is also just as important.
That's an excellent point. So as closing remarks, my question would be, do you have any advice for aspiring science policy folks? So we've talked a lot about it during the session, but maybe if you want to summarize or reiterate or reinforce some points, I think this would be the time. So for example, Shweta, you mentioned becoming a CSPC volunteer, and the MyTax fellowship, which there are different fellowships now out there instead of the MyTax, but hopefully the MyTax one does come back. Taylor, you mentioned joining different committees, and that's how you can get your foot into the door. And Arthi, you mentioned, again, just trying and getting yourself out there. Any last words or any advice for graduate students or early career researchers or early career professionals who are trying to begin their career in science policy?
Should I go?
Yes, Shweta, yeah.
Okay. So, talk to people. Like, this is another one of those spaces where information is not readily available if you just Google. So reach out to people, talk to people. If you can go to conferences, do. Twitter is a really important X. Eh, yeah, I hate to say it, but it is an important, those rabbit holes actually do lead somewhere, right? So if today you were to just go and see who I follow on Twitter, and then you filter the ones that are relevant to you, here's a list for you, right? And you can follow organizations if you don't want to follow individuals, and you can get real-time information about opportunities such as those that Aarti accessed in her career, right? Things like that, fellowships. And Twitter is a really passive, or X is a really passive way of getting information if you're following the right accounts and if you're able to curate that. So it can be a very, very powerful tool. And I have so many folks who I've met in real life, and then we say to each other, "Oh, you know what? I've seen you on social media." And so science policy has a pretty strong social media presence, especially on Twitter/X, somewhat on LinkedIn. And I do think that, especially in this world of folks who have graduate degrees, who are looking for alternative career paths, which are not that alternative actually, this community is very friendly. If you reached out to folks, former science policy fellows, for example, you are very likely going to get a lot of good sort of phone interviews out of that. So stop there.
Thanks. Taylor?
That was super practical, and mine's more philosophical, just because I think when I was going through, grad school and everything, you get so many different people telling you there's no jobs, there's no blah, there's this, you have to go this way if you want to do that. And I think it's just remembering to follow, it sounds corny, but like follow your values, follow your passions, invest your time where you want to, not because somebody's telling you that it's going to land you this job or that job. Because at the end of the day, you really have to make yourself happy, and you really have to find that environment, find those relationships, find the people that will champion you. And that only comes really organically and naturally. You can't force those things sometimes. And so the only way for me that was possible was to follow my values and to follow those passion projects, which were often not paid, not supported. We're off the side of my desk. We're at ridiculous hours at night, but because that was where I wanted to go and where I saw myself going. So again, more philosophical, but I just don't think, like, don't undersell your own vision for your life and the way that you think it's going to go. Even if you don't know the job, the career, what it's called, just make sure that at the core of it, the environment, the values of the mission statements, all of those things align with your values, your personal mission, etc., because that's where you'll thrive.
I'm loving this balance of philosophy and practicality. Arthi.
Maybe I'll try putting those two together. I totally agree with what Shweta and Taylor just said. But another thing I just wanted to point out is you don't have to do everything, right? We've talked about, we've been part of a lot of boards and committees and all these different volunteer things, but of course, not everyone has the time or the privilege to do these types of things, and that's also okay. So please don't put pressure on yourself to do all of these things. If there's one thing that you want to do or are interested in, follow that, pursue that. If you can't, put the time to do multiple things, that's totally okay. And so don't feel like that's the only way that you can kind of breach this sphere, because a lot of people, have other things going on. So I think that's just something I wanted to point out as well. And you can get to these places with different experiences. It doesn't have to always be from volunteering or joining a board or joining a committee. There's a lot of different ways people just apply. They have their practical skills, their job skills, other things that they've been doing. So don't undervalue those either, right? Working retail is a really important thing. It builds your communication skills. It builds your resilience. You meet a lot of very different people. And I think it's important to realize that everything that you do brings something forward for your career moving forward in that path. So yeah, just don't undervalue yourself. There's always something really cool out there waiting for you, an opportunity that you can take, and it might sometimes take some time to get there. Rejection sucks, but it happens to all of us. So just continue trying, and if you're really passionate about something, I think that you'll be able to get yourself there, whether it's through a traditional path or an alternative path or 20 million other pathways. Just believe in yourself. I think that's the biggest thing, is to believe in yourself.
Thank you. So thank you again to the three of you for being so generous with your time and your insights, and sharing your experience and being vulnerable with us tonight or today, depending on where you live. I'd like to again thank CC UNESCO for their support. I'd like to thank Antoine and Anna for their support today during the event, and I'd like to thank my co-organizer Maya. So a report will be coming out soon summarizing our discussion today, and it will be published on our website and on our socials. The recording will also be available on our socials very soon. And I'd like to point out that SB will be holding elections for its executive committee in the next month. So stay tuned for that. And if you're interested, do join us. That is an excellent way to get into science policy. And finally, if it pleases you, please do follow us on social media. We have LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X. So follow us on all of that. So thank you again for spending the night or this hour and a half with us. And we hope to see you again soon. Bye.